show.
The broadcast live on there.
Hi everyone, Salam alaikum, good afternoon, Ramadan Mubarak, and thank you for joining us for this panel on the situation of minorities in India, part of Justice for All's Save India campaign. Far from being a great equalizer, we know that the coronavirus pandemic has only further exacerbated the conditions of repression facing the most vulnerabilized and marginalized communities in India, including Dalits, Adivasis, Muslims, and migrant workers. Just yesterday, we learned that 16 migrant workers were killed when they were run over by a train. They were so exhausted trying to walk home during the lockdown that they fell asleep on the tracks. Under cover of the pandemic, the Indian government has increased and further intensified its repression of dissident intellectuals, journalists, and activists, including with the arrest of the eminent Dalit intellectual Dr. Anand Tumde. Muslim student leaders of the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests have also been arrested. And just a few days ago, the chair of Delhi's Minority Commission had his house raided and was charged with sedition and with fomenting enmity between different groups in India, even as BJP politicians walk freely, having called for Muslim quote-unquote traitors to be shot and having spread fake news about Muslim supposed corona jihad. Of course, these are not new developments coming out of nowhere, but rather represent the continuation of pre-existing dynamics and forces that many analysts and activists, including members of our panel, have long been warning about. And so we are so delighted and grateful to have our panel of experts to help us put in a broader political and historical context some of the developments that we are seeing unfolding in India right now, as well as help us understand how we as international solidarity activists can help alleviate and combat some of the circumstances of oppression. So I'll begin by briefly introducing our panelists, and then they will each speak for around 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from our virtual floor. Our first speaker is Dr. Sanobar Umar, who graduated with a PhD in history from Queen's University. Her dissertation focused on the intersections of casteism and Islamophobia in racializing and dehumanizing India's Muslim community. Prior to completing her PhD, Umar did a Master's of Science in Migration Studies from the University of Oxford and a Master's in International Studies from the Graduate Institute of Geneva. Our second speaker is Professor Ashok Shwain, who is Professor of Peace and Conflict Research, UNESCO Chair of International Water Cooperation, and the Director of Research School of International Water Cooperation at Uppsala University in Sweden. He has been a MacArthur Visiting Fellow at the University of Chicago, a Fellow at the UN Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva, and Visiting Professor at the University of British Columbia, University of Maryland, Stanford University, McGill University, Tufts University, and the University of Natural Sciences and Life Sciences in Vienna. And our third speaker is Muhammad Yusuf Dadani, who is a community activist originally from India. He is affiliated with the Indian American Muslim Council and currently serves as the president of its Dallas chapter. He has been involved in Indian Muslim advocacy efforts for more than a decade at the grassroots level. So we are so grateful and honored to have this eminent panel of experts with us, and I will turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Sanobar Umar.
Salam to everyone. Hi, Azita. Thank you for that introduction, and I'm very excited to be a part of this really important panel. I'm going to approximately 15 minutes, and what I want to focus on is how the discourse on the war of terrorism has been used by India to legitimize Hindu nationalist violence against Muslims in India, and how Hindu nationalism has not just used the discourse of the war on terrorism to stigmatize Muslims, but also perpetuated our ideas and contributed to ideas of who we associate with terrorism and how do we secularize even the terrorism of non-Muslims. As the world watches on, several academic and semi-academic journalists and personal columns have noted with alarm the violence that is increasingly getting normalized in India against minorities. These have ranged from gleefully sharing videos of Dalits being thrashed and tortured for touching dead cow carcasses, which they use for the hides of which they use for their living, um, to an Adivasi slash tribal man being killed just because he stole a petty sum of 200 rupees, that's about $10 or so, to several videos of Muslim men begging for their lives and forced to recite Hindu chants before they were lynched. And in many instances, even policemen watched on as these instances of violences took place, as well as the much covered case of the death and murder of a Kashmiri child, Asiya, in Kashmir last year by Hindu nationalists who not only did they commit murder against her, but many of their supporters came out on the streets saying that they were not guilty men for killing and murdering an 8-year-old child. Uh, Understandably, especially in the past few months, many progressive Hindus and Muslims have decried against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which has taken place in India. The current Citizenship Amendment Act, which are henceforth referred to as CEA, is the protest against it is being led by Muslim students, Muslim women, and other secular Hindus. And the CEA, along with the National Citizenship Registration Act, or the NCR, threatens to not just prevent Muslim refugees in India from countries like Ahmadiyyas in Pakistan, Afghan refugees, displaced Kashmiri refugees, and Rohingyas from getting citizenship and equitable access to asylum in India as they flee persecution and conflict in their respective countries, but also to significantly expel and expunge India's overwhelmingly poor population of Muslims, because they're being required to produce documents that prove that they have ancestors from centuries ago in India, which even many middle class Hindus like Harsh Mandar claim are the kind of the documents that they can't produce, let alone a poor and largely illiterate population. Perhaps it should not come as a shock that India has violated the Geneva Convention and sent back Rohingya refugees facing persecution to Myanmar. And this kind of violent Islamophobic history in India can be traced roughly to the 1920s with the formation of the Hindu nationalist organization called Hindu Mahasabha. And there were primarily two founders of this movement, V.S. Munje and Munje and V.S. Savarkar, V.D. Savarkar. And what's also interesting about these two founders of the Hindu nationalist movement since 1920s. This is when India was under British colonialism before the state of Pakistan was formed in 1947, is that Savarkar was the first person to suggest dividing India into two separate countries because he believed that Hindus and Muslims were antagonistic to each other. In fact, at one point, Savarkar even expressed loyalty to the British colonial rule, but always expressed anti-Muslim hostility. And then Munje was particularly casteist. He tried to justify the Hindu caste structure, or where people are from their birth are relegated to a particular occupation, roughly speaking, and considered pure or impure based on where they are placed in the caste hierarchy. He justified this structure as an inherently just structure. And one of the things that we are now witnessing in India is not just Hindu nationalism, which started off in the 1920s, now becoming a very prominent political movement, and with the BJP coming to majority house power in 2014 and 2019, is that we also need to realize that in India, Islamophobia is informed by a long history of casteism also against Muslims. Many people are not aware of this, but according to some scholars and activists such as Remy Delage and Dr. Ejaz Ali, about 75% of India's population consists of lower caste and Dalit converts. In 1950, the Indian Constitution, however, recognized that because Dalits, or so-called untouchables, are historically disadvantaged groups, they have the right to get access to certain affirmative action policies, um, especially in the field of education and government representation and public jobs. But this caste affirmative policy was not extended to Dalit and lower caste Muslims, who it was believed that just because they converted to Islam, they were no longer going to face the stigma of casteism because caste doesn't exist in Islam. But what it took away from is the fact that it's not just about eclipsing caste through conversion. There's been a long history of intergenerational poverty amongst Muslims. And by denying them affirmative action policy rights, it prevented them from availing opportunities that could have led to more equal resources be disposable to them. And I want to even note over here that this all happened in the 1950s when the so-called secular Congress was in power. So this is not I'm not just pointing out Hindu nationalist complicity against Muslims over here. I'm also pointing out how even the Congress entrenched anti-Muslim propaganda and anti-Muslim policies. In fact, the term secularism, which a lot of Indians, progressive Indians, are saying that the CEA, by virtue of discriminating against Muslims from accessing refugee law, from accessing citizenship rights as refugees, is against the secular fabric of the constitution. In fact, the very word secular was not introduced in the Indian constitution preamble until 1975. It was introduced by Sanjay Gandhi, the son of the notorious Indira Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister of India, and who also simultaneously carried out anti-Muslim sterilization campaigns in the 1970s. This is very tragic. It particularly targeted at Muslim and Dalit men and women, sterilizing them against their will. And I also feel like at this moment with Citizenship Amendment Act, international news outlets like The Guardian have noticed that India is building detention centers the size of 7 football fields. So, and this is going to lead to the large statelessness within the Indian population, Indian Muslim population. And this history of rendering Muslims as not indigenous to India, as illegal migrants, or in distorted history textbooks as foreign invaders from medieval times, is also embedded in viewing Muslims as constantly the outsider in India. So, along with caste histories, you have these other discourses in place that are trying to render India's Muslims as not originally from India or not really Indian. And what's also fascinating is that what many people forget about the current Citizenship Amendment Act is that in 1984 there was a massacre on the borders of Assam and Bangladesh called the Nelly Massacre, which led to the deaths of 5,000 Muslims. Until date, many of those Muslims are referred to as illegal Bangladeshis, which is very problematic because, again, their documents for proving whether they're Indian or Bangladeshi, many of these very poor Muslims don't have that. And irrespective of documentation, you don't just go and kill 5,000 people. There are many instances of Indian Muslims being subjected to violence legislatively and institutionally. Take, for example, the Indian National Police Commission, which since the 1970s has refused to acknowledge that there is anti-Muslim bias in police forces, even though many of the mass killings that have been carried out against Muslims have been carried by police officers in India. Or take the Enemy Property Act of 1968. It was an act which was legislated in 1968, basically suggesting that any Indian Muslim with kinship ties to Pakistan can be viewed as an enemy within the Indian state. And although this was supposed to be just a wartime measure, under the present BJP government in 2017, more and more properties of Muslims are being appropriated just on the basis of suspecting them for having any Pakistani ties or relatives. So again, what I'm pointing out here is Indian Muslims have to constantly prove that they are loyal and trustworthy citizens. And institutionally, they're facing police violence, their properties are being appropriated, The decline of Urdu institutionally in many North Indian states is also an attack on their cultural and linguistic rights and so forth. So basically, on every front, this is happening. And unfortunately, the Indian Supreme Court is no longer considered the bastion of human rights either, because controversially they hung Afzal Guru, a Kashmiri man who was suspected of partaking in a terrorist activity. And even though there wasn't much evidence against him, the Indian Supreme Court justified death penalty against this man as due to the consciousness of the nation. And even recently, the Babri Masjid verdict. The Babri Masjid was a historical mosque in India built by the Mughal Emperor Babur sometime in the 16th or 17th century. And it was demolished by Hindu nationalists in 1992, claiming that it was the exact site where Lord Ram from Hindu mythology was born. And even in the recent verdict last year that the Supreme Court of India gave, that plot of land where the mosque once stood was given to Hindus to build a temple, and Muslims were allocated with another few acres of land to build their mosque. In a sense, it justified Hindu extremism. In a way, it gave legitimacy to that instead of acknowledging the difference between history and myth. And then you have the Arms Act of 1956 in India, where the army is pretty much allowed to commit with impunity untold crimes in Northeast India, in Kashmir. And this act, again, emerged in 1956. So, again, what I'm pointing out over here is not just Hindu nationalist complicity, but also the complicity of non-Hindu nationalist political forces like the Congress in entrenching or at least planting the roots of Islamophobia in India. Yeah, and yet the war on terrorism has made it seem like, as we all know, on our Islamophobic times, there's a tendency to say not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. And that kind of discourse that the war on terrorism, which emerged from America after 9/11, has been utilized by Hindu nationalists to dehumanize Muslims, to stigmatize Muslims, to downplay their own violence against Muslims, even though under Sabarmati attack, Akshardhan temple attack, Mecca Masjid attack, Melgaon attack. These were all carried out by Hindu extremists against Muslims. And in fact, one of the women charged with terrorism crimes against Muslims is right now a member of parliament in India. So India's very political structure is under deep threat right now, when terrorists are being democratically elected to positions of power. And of course, needless to say, as soon as they come to power, charges against them are dropped and such forth.
Sanabar, maybe just 30 more seconds and wrap up.
Oh, yeah, I'll just try to wrap up. So I think what we also need to focus on is how Hindu diaspora is working in the West as well in entrenching certain ideas about Hindu nationalist diaspora, in entrenching certain ideas about the figure of the Muslim as the constant terrorist, and how movies like Eat, Pray, Love are being used in these neoliberal times to make India, to propagate this image of India as incredible India. At best, India is the haven of yoga and Eastern spirituality with vibrant colors. At worst, it's poor, dirty, and maybe unsafe for women. But by and large, the fact that Muslims are in India facing such extreme persecution, Dalits in India are facing such extreme persecution, Adivasis and other minorities, is somehow flown out the window because of the focus on Muslims exclusively as terrorists and downplaying Christian, Hindu, and other non-religious forms of violence. I think I will conclude on that note. But one of the things that I also want to bring to people's attention over here at the moment is that with the advent of coronavirus, there was a group called Tablighi Jamaat who collected, despite orders about people not collecting in large groups, and they shouldn't have done that. That was a public health risk. However, now Hindu nationalists have used that gathering of Muslims to target the Muslim community at large and say that they're spreading coronavirus to India because they want to kill Hindus. And the hashtag that is going around is called Corona Jihad. You can see how ridiculous and Islamophobic that term is. But again, it comes from a history of casteism, it comes from a history of Islamophobia, it comes from a history of dehumanizing Muslims to such an extent that Muslims are viewed as diseases themselves. Muslims are seen as people who infect and endanger the wider Hindu population. That's all I'd like to say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar, for situating the current anti-Muslim violence and its longer legislative, institutional, and social history, and also highlighting the intersections with anti-casteism. Now we will turn to Professor Ashok Swain. Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Aziza, for generous introduction. Thank you for inviting me to speak to this important occasion. And I think, Sanam, thank you for putting giving all these informations quite brilliantly from the beginning, putting for us all to reflect on. I will try to bring some the background a little bit, and as well what is happening now, and also what is also going on in the diaspora side. India as a country, when in 1947 got the independence and became a country, there has been a lot of question mark whether how the country will survive. There are many people who wrote and spoke that it won't be for long. But what happened since 1947, the country as an independent country and also a democratic country, because of some a few months of break at the time of emergency in 1977 to 1980. But otherwise, it worked as a democratic secular country. And it's not only survived, it thrived. It became one of the major economic powerhouse. It became quite important in all kinds of science achievements, technological achievements. It became quite known as a secular, democratic, scientific country in the world. What has happened? There was economic growth, which took place quite massive. I mean, in a much bigger way as compared to China in the last decade, also, which was gave the hope that particularly from 2003-4 to 2012, that it gave hope that India will be probably be another China economically, and that besides that, it was a democratic country. What has happened? This is that it was, though everything. I mean, I'm saying that it was good, but I think there have been problems between Hindus and Muslims, between Hindus and other minority groups, Christians, Sikhs. That has been there. It's not that it has been a very a place for it was a heaven for the minorities, or it's not a heaven for the many of the Hindu groups. I mean, if you look at the Dalits, or you look at the tribal populations, then indigenous population, you see that there have been issues. But they were living together. There was a lot of hope. There was a lot of possibility of working together, particularly Muslims, though they were economically much more, because there have been discrimination has been part of Indian. I mean, it's nothing new. It has been there, discrimination within the Hindu society, and also with the Hindus, with the Muslims. Muslims have been as poor as Dalits, even even at the time of 2014, I will come back to the 2014. So they have been discriminated economically. There have been a number of anti-Muslim riots has taken place before. Those are for the time purposes, but there was a hope among the Muslims in the country that they can really contribute to the political process change, that they really thought that they will be part of the country and as an equal shareholder in this country. That has changed quite dramatically in 2014 when Narendra Modi became the prime minister. When Narendra Modi is a character, when he became the chief minister in 2002, there was a massive anti-Muslim riot or program took place in Gujarat. More than 2,000 people were killed, most majority of them Muslims, and that really, that the world knew. He was the guy who has been not given the permission to visit the Western Europe and North America before for 10 years almost. He was the chief minister, and but in never ever in Indian political history, an elected chief minister directly used the unparliamentary language against the Muslim, the way Modi has been done from 2002 onwards, particularly till 2010-12. So it was very clear when he got elected that what kind of person, what kind of leader India is getting. But of course, he sold that time. His core supporter knew that what is coming, why they supported him. But there are some other people, those who support him, not only they were anti-Congress, which they have reasons to do so, but also they try to justify it because that he will be bringing the development. With Modi came to power, the things have become much more open in India. The Muslims particularly, and other minorities, Christians, Sikhs, you name them. They're all been targeted to a large extent. But the Muslims have been the main target. The 2014 to 2019, the past 5 years, which has been, beef became a big issue. Beef is targeting particularly Muslims and the Dalits. Lynching became very common. There are a large number of people, which Sanabar was talking about, large number of people targeted because of the on the name of cow protection. So people, the Hindu right-wing groups walked around the streets, finding people to. They got really open. Power. They can anyone attack anyone. There has been a number of lynching. India became a kind of lynching capital in the name of cow protection. Then there is also love jihad, which came in that they're saying that the Muslim boys are marrying the Hindu girls to convert them. That's all kinds of, even though, it went to the Supreme Court. This is absolutely nonsense, which was being put to the people. And there was also a lot of attack took place against Muslims in the name of that. They kept changing the history books. That did all kinds of things. But those were not at the government level. Those were the party cadres level, while the Modi was, as the government, was not directly responsible, though they're directly protecting them or somehow protecting that kind of actions. Then the 2019, when he got elected, particularly because his economy was not doing well, the way he came into the name of development, but that development went somewhere. There was nothing. But then he targeted Pakistan. There was an attack, all kinds of issues. So making Pakistan as the election issue, he won the election in a much bigger way. So the 2019 election was about Pakistan, vilifying or the targeting Pakistan, targeting Kashmir, and targeting Muslims. Those are he forgot the development issue. These became the major issue. These three issues, and he won the election, getting much more electoral support in the member of parliament than what he had got in 2014, in spite of ruining the economy completely. And then, after coming to power in 2019, everything has gone out. There is no such even inhibition to behaving like as a government of a secular country. The triple talaq bill. No way somebody can really defend the kind of triple talaq. But the kind of question is that why only Muslim community? Why you penalize? Why you criminalize this? Why the people? There are a large number of Hindus also, those who abandon their wife. Why not to make it for everyone? Kashmir, the Article 370 was taken overnight. Then, all kinds of attack against the Kashmiri Muslims anywhere. It has been continuing even now. Then there has been a Babri Mosque, which also Sanaba was mentioning. The kind of Babri Mosque issue goes to the 96 when they really uh, uh, 92, sorry, they took it out. And then what happened, the demolished it illegally, but then the Supreme Court was given a kind of, Supreme Court came together with the government. It was a kind of setup. And then Supreme Court gave the ruling that gave that illegally demolished land to the people, those who had illegally demolished it, to build the Ram temple, while not taking actions against those who have committed this illegal act. The illegality got, instead of being punished, they got benefits of doing that kind of act. So then, though I think Sanabar also has mentioned the Citizenship Amendment Act. Like only Muslims are to be not to be given the kind of citizenship if they come from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and India. It's Nepal. Sorry, Pakistan. Why you leave Nepal? Why you leave Sri Lanka? Why you leave China? What about Bhutan? I mean, what is the real reason? And if you are doing it, particularly if you look at the present, what are the religious discrimination? Religious discrimination, Afghanistan and Bangladesh have done much better than India. So why we are thinking of religious discrimination in Afghanistan and Bangladesh? They're not even happy. I mean, for Pakistan relationship is always, but even Bangladesh and Afghanistan were also quite unhappy that this kind of Citizenship Amendment Act has come. Of course, there are lots of protests. Protests has not been the huge operation took place. All kinds of ways they wanted to, but due to coronavirus threat, it has gone down. But I think, like any other part of the world, the protests are coming back, and it will come back. And then I think the coronavirus. I mean, when the coronavirus came, India is fighting coronavirus, but the Modi regime is fighting Muslims in the name of this Tablighi Jamaat. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous that you blame a particular congregation of 3,000 to 4,000 people whom you gave the permission. You know that this Tablighi Jamaat also had done this kind of congregation in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, in the last week of February. Malaysia has been accusing them also that they have been that kind of congregation helped to spread the coronavirus in Malaysia. Why did you allow them to do so? If you allow them, why do you blame them? They didn't do it illegally. And there are many congregations, religious, political congregation took place in the country after that. So it has been continuing, and they're also targeting Rohingya refugees now. So it's always this kind of event of high risk. They haven't left it not to communalize it. But this is real. The problem is that India's secularism, democracy, and scientific temper have come under serious threat, or either it's a virtually, whether it will survive or not, it has become a big question now. The people, they really forget India as a country has survived because of secularism and democracy. And that's, if we take that away, of course, the survival of the country is in danger. Hindu Rashtra, it's never going to take place. Hindu Rashtra, India will not be a country if it becomes a Hindu country, Hindu Rashtra, formally a Hindu country. It will not be a democracy, it will not be secular, and without being a democratic and secular country, India kind of a country it cannot really be a country. So I think it's extremely important, not only for the minority, but the people those who understand the politics. They should need to stand up. They need to look at the Hindus need to stand up. They realize that this is what they're taking the whole country and all the Hindus towards a situation that the world will look at them as the culprit, as the way they're destroying their own country. This is, I want to come back to this, the diaspora politics, how this has been. The diaspora, Hindu diaspora, or Hindutva diaspora, I call them, it has been spreading its wings in the different parts of the world, particularly in the Western Europe. United States has been quite powerful, particularly the RSS, which call them HSS in this part of the world, have really gone into organizing themselves in a much bigger way. I mean, even in a country like Sweden, you will see them. There are 5 temples where different HSS organizations are going. The problem is, in the Hindu diaspora, which has been in the forefront of protecting its own minority rights in these countries, we want if there is anything comes in a towel or in a bottle of something or an advertisement, any God's picture, we get really, or even there is some kind of beef fat in the McDonald. All this kind of becomes a huge issue for
Professor
the
Swain,
Hindus
30
living
more
here.
seconds.
But this, thank you. What happens when these things comes to them, that they at the same time, while they are protecting their own rights or own minority rights in the country where they live, they at the same time they are supporting a regime in their home country, that is in India, a regime which is anti-minority and wants to be a majoritarian regime, and that's what, which is the absolutely there is no logic behind it, and they should understand that if the way things are, the way the Gulf states, the countries, the Islamophobic acts or the social media post by these Hindutva diaspora, or now even in Canada, the things going on, it has become now international community has taken notice of it. They have the whole this politics has divided the diaspora, Indian diaspora outside. It has divided even the Hindu diaspora between the Hindutva diaspora and the moderate Hindu diaspora. I think it's extremely important that we need to realize that this is very important to keep this pressure on this Hindutva regime. Hindutva regime or the Narendra Modi regime, if anything, it fears the international criticism. So if we really want to, because they have been totally, the opposition has been sidelined. They have been using this majoritarian politics. They have been not been able to. Opposition has not been really taking in the ground. Many of the opposition parties are actually following the majoritarian agenda, not openly, but just to become a B party of the BJP. So I think, but the only thing they are fearful, this Narendra Modi regime, is the international opinion. And I think it's extremely important that we should really look at it, that how this international opinion, international voice should be raised against this regime to keep it in its, to follow the Indian constitutions, the politics of secularism and politics of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Swain. I think instilling fear in Modi is an excellent note to end on. Thank you for that incisive picture of both the dangers and the contradictions of Modi's ethno-nationalist electoral manipulations. Now we will turn to our third speaker, Muhammad Yusuf Dadani, community activist. Please.
Respected and distinguished guests and dear brothers and sisters, peace be upon all of you, and I thank you all for this opportunity to speak on the issue of what we as Americans living here in the West but having roots in the Indian subcontinent, or not even even if not in the Indian subcontinent, those who cherish India's secular traditions, what can we do from here to ensure that India does not become a Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu state. This is essentially what I will be speaking on. So let me just introduce myself. I'm here on behalf of an organization called the Indian American Muslim Council. And first of all, we would like to appreciate the fact that Justice for All has taken this initiative to educate the American citizens at large about the problems that are currently happening in India. Our other distinguished guests on this panel have already spoken at length about it. So I will just focus on, as I mentioned, what we will be doing, what we can do from here. So first of all, we have to understand that Muslims in India are not a very small population. They are 15% of India, even though percentage-wise you might think that that's a very small percentage, but in terms of numbers, just sheer numbers, there are approximately 200 million Indian Muslims in India, which is the largest Indian minority, Muslim minority anywhere in the world. Even in terms of population, we outrank most Muslim countries. So what is at stake, as the professors on this panel have clearly mentioned, that India is heading down a path of what is a slow genocide, I would say. See, nowadays, genocide in that sense, the way that happened with the Holocaust, or even more recently with the Rwandan genocide, is not in vogue in terms of it gives very bad name to the country and so on. Country becomes a pariah, the government becomes a pariah. So what the Indian government has embarked on is a slow process of genocide, and many others have actually already put this warning, has been letting out this warning. Genocide Watch, for example, you can see there how the various steps of genocide and where India is on that pathway to genocide. So what can we do? So first of all, and when I say we, I'm talking about Muslims in the United States as well as other Americans who, as I had mentioned, cherish India's secular traditions and would not like to see India turn into India is the second most populous country in the world. They don't want to see such a large chunk of humanity being governed and being living under a political structure that is an extremist fascist ideology. That itself just should ring alarm bells around the world. So what can we do? First of all, as I had mentioned, that we need to understand what is at stake. Programs like this that JFA has organized and other organizations are organizing are an excellent way to learn what is happening. They bring together people from diverse facets who will talk about different aspects of the Hindutva project. That's the first and foremost thing. But after we have understood what is at stake, what is happening, we need to spread this awareness. Even now, most Americans are not really aware of what is happening in India. And most Americans, as we know, they cherish secularism, they cherish liberal democracy. And that is what they want for the rest of the world too. Having lived under a secular democracy, having enjoyed its fruits, for the minorities, this has been a great blessing. So they are also against this kind of extremism and hatred because they have seen what this can do to humanity at large. So we need to make sure that they are aware, as one of the professors on the panel had pointed out, that generally when we speak about India, the image that has been built up is, well, it's a land where there is a lot of diversity, which is true, and there is a lot of tolerance, which unfortunately is no longer true. And it's a land which is exotic, exotic kind of religions and lots of historical buildings and artifacts and architecture and food and so on, which is all correct. But unfortunately, this has kind of shielded India from the kind of criticism and the kind of, you might say, the harsh glare of, shining a light on the excesses of the Indian state and the way that it has veered towards majoritarianism. So we need to make sure that this information gets out to people. Nowadays, it's very easy for us to spread this information. We live in an age where the world is literally like a village, and with the advent of social media and these new forms of communications, everyone can be an opinion maker or a journalist, depending on how much time they devote. So this is very important to educate, and especially educating our lawmakers. Even till a few years ago, many of the lawmakers, were not really aware of the number of Muslims who lived in India. They always thought India as a country where Hindus live. Not many lawmakers, and as not many, unfortunately, it's a fact that in general, Americans are not very well educated about geography and history of the world as such. Nowadays, of course, awareness is increasing as the world shrinks, and people are able to kind of be up to speed to what is happening. But as I said, most lawmakers were unaware of the fact that India has the largest Muslim minority, and this is something that we need to address really really on a war footing, to make sure that all of our local elected representatives as well as local government officials understand that India has this large Muslim population and actually are kept aware of what is happening in India. So one of the things you can do is keep your local politicians, especially your congressional representatives, aware of what is happening in India and how India is going down this path of becoming a Hindutva-based extremist fascist state. The other thing is that you have to establish a relationship with them. You cannot just send them one letter, one petition, and then just sit back and say, okay, we have done. So this is a question that has come up. I'll address that. What's the best use of the USCIR? As you know, that USCIRF, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, it is USCIRF, has recently issued its 2019 report in which it has placed India as a country of particular concern, which is basically saying that the government of India has now been complicit, or at least has turned a blind eye towards people who are fomenting religious hatred, and actually given impunity to those who are perpetrating violence against Muslims and other minorities. And this is not the first time that actually India has been placed in this category. The last time it was done was in 2004, in the aftermath of the pogrom that happened against Muslims in Gujarat in the year 2002. So this was this has been a very important report, and what we can do is to publicize this report, first of all, make everybody aware of it, and more importantly, send this report over to your congressional representative, or at least excerpts that talk about what is going on in India. Try to meet with them, try to convey to them that you are very concerned about what is happening, and push them towards asking the State Department to start implementing the USCIRF report. The USCIRF report, while it is coming from a statutory body, it is a body set up by the US Congress, but it does not have the force of law. That can only be it is up to the Department of State and Congress to actually use that report and to implement laws that it is suggesting, implementing the steps that it is suggesting. That can also include, as it has suggested, targeted sanctions against those Indian lawmakers and Indian officials and politicians who have been complicit in this persecution of minorities. So that's a very important point. And actually, as was mentioned by Professor Swain, that the only thing that the government in India, the current dispensation, is afraid of is international problem, and they are very concerned about their image. How you have seen how Modi has gone to great lengths to cultivate this image of being like a statesman, by showing that he has friendships with all the big players in the world, like with President Trump, or even with the Israeli Prime Minister, and so on. So the point again is that this is what we can do, is to make sure that our lawmakers hear from us that that this report has been out, and we push them towards implementing its suggestions, what it has been proposing in that report. So this is the answer to the question that was asked. The other thing what we can do is, as I had mentioned, is just to
Brother Muhammad, just maybe one more minute, and then we'll move.
Okay, sure. And I will wrap up here. But the one thing, as you have noticed, even on our panel, we have Professor Swain. Now, Professor Swain is actually a Hindu, but the Hindus are the biggest bulwark against Hindutva. That's how I will put it. Hindus are the biggest bulwark against Hindutva. And they are the only ones who will be able to halt it in its footsteps. So we need to strengthen them. We need to build alliances with them. There are lots of organizations now. I can name, like, for example, there is an organization called Hindus for Human Rights, which has stood up against this Hindutva onslaught, by this corruption of Hindutva, Hinduism as a religion into an ideology that, others, everybody else. The other thing is, there are also on campus some organizations that are sprouted. For example, there is an organization called Students Against Hindutva Ideology. So the campus is actually the battleground of ideas, as you know. And unfortunately, Hindutva has penetrated the campus, the college campus, in the guise of, Hindu student association. Sometimes they have infiltrated even inside the student association, taken over the leadership, and tried to peddle this soft Hindutva. So this is something we need to get our students involved in, and to build alliances with these organizations. Now, it is very ironic, right, that the biggest promoters of Hindutva in the United States are those who have flourished the most in America's liberal democracy, but would like to deprive Indian Muslims and other minorities of the very same rights which have allowed them to become the most prosperous minority in the United States, right? But that is the way it is, Unfortunately, this is the case. So with that, I will wrap up now, and I will really encourage everybody who has joined this panel today and joined this program today to please do not take this as a, very be very complacent about this. In fact, the Muslims are, as somebody has put it very correctly, that we are the canaries in the coal mine. And once we are the ones that are signaling to the world that India is going down a path that it should not go down, and we cannot afford to see 20% of humanity being ruled by extremist fascist ideology. We have seen what this ideology had wrought in the early 20th century. The Second World War was wrought by such an ideology in Europe, and this can very well be another harbinger of another such conflict in this world. So with that, I will conclude, and thank you once again to Justice for All for organizing this wonderful event.
Thank you so much, Brother Muhammad, for that very incisive perspective from a long history of on-the-ground activism. Now we will turn to questions from our virtual floor. So if you have any questions, please do send them in, and we will read them out for our panelists. And in the meantime, maybe I'll start things off by asking a question. So if you could all talk about a bit from your particular context, what are some of the international relationships that are enabling the sustenance and the power of the BJP government? We know in Canada, for example, which is often hailed as an exemplary liberal democracy, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, went on a highly publicized trip to India a while ago, which was very much oriented around building ties of friendship with the Indian government. So can you talk a bit about, for our particular context, what are some of the particular political, social, and economic relationships with India that we can be targeting? And what are some of the domestic forces that are acting against our activism to build a more just relationship with India that helps to counteract some of the oppressive forces that we're seeing?
So I just answer first. I think Brother Omedullah, someone just pointed out, why don't we reach out and form more local alliances? A battle is fought on several fronts, and the battle to preserve India's secular fabric is obviously going to be fought on several fronts. I think one of the more important local alliances that we do need to focus on is to have more solidarity and ties with Black people and Indigenous peoples in North America who are struggling against white supremacy, because as I pointed out earlier, Islamophobia has become a global phenomena. It's not just a phenomena that emerged in the global north and then the global south is following suit. It's a phenomena that has been informed mutually. Like India is informing America's Islamophobia at the moment. American war on terrorism has informed Islamophobia globally. And these are enmeshed in discourses of white supremacy and upper caste privilege. As Professor Swan also pointed out, that even though many Indians recognize that they are minorities in global north countries and fight for their own rights, we also have to keep in mind that we have to show solidarity to other groups that are facing persecution if we want empathy for our own Indian Muslim groups. And same for Indian Muslims within India. We have to show solidarity with Dalits and Adivasis against upper caste hegemony and oppression, and other kinds of people who are against minorities, simply put, because obviously not all upper caste Hindus are complicit in the system. Many are calling out this system. Another thing I think we need to keep in mind is, especially during coronavirus going on right now, there's a lot of focus on China, and there's a lot of focus on how China is a communist government, and there has been a lot of media coverage of how China is apparently a threat to the global order and so forth. But I think what often happens in the process is that people overlook India, because India is largely seen by global north governments as a massive consumer market. And I think the economic capitalist logics of that, of viewing India as a consumer market where Amazon wants to open its industries, where other MNCs want to have access to cheap labor and cheaper lands,
and where defense industries and weapons manufacturers are also very interested in selling to.
Absolutely. And like how even that within an international relations forum plays out in a particular way, where there is a tendency to downplay the violence that is happening in India, because India is seen as a place where Western countries can plant their own projects in. So I think those are also some of the things we need to unpack, those complexities, to understand both local and global forces and how they're converging right now.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. Professor Swain, any thoughts from the Swedish and perhaps broader European context? I'm sorry, you're muted. Could we unmute Professor Swain, please? Thanks.
Yes, now I'm done. I think this is something, the fascinating question. The question is what exactly the strong point, because always when you try to take on somebody, we need to realize what are the strong points, what are the weak points. The strong point, the Modi government started very strongly because it came out the democratic election. That's democracy. As Sanaba, you would rightly mention, China is a kind of, the West looks at India to give some kind of counterbalance to the China. So these are the two factors which you look at the kind of praise it got. Even Obama went out of his way to greet Modi and be friends. So I think that really acted for some time. What has happened now? The things have changed. We must realize that economy has failed. And once economy has failed, it has taken out a major part of this Modi's charisma of selling the money. I mean, in spite of all kinds of things going on, giving tidbits to the Trump and his kids, but that's not really going to play a major role. The one thing which he is the Indian foreign policy has become, I call it the second kind of Saudi foreign policy, buying arms. But the Saudis have oil, India doesn't have. So India is buying arms, second largest arms importer, and most of these politics which is going on and the kind of friendship has been developed by him with the Bibi in Israel, the Trump in US or in the UK. These are all the France. These are all on the basis of purchasing arms, and I think that has a limited value. What has happened now? There has been a large public opinion against Modi. You could see that not only the liberal newspapers, they are writing against the Hindutva politics, but also the financial newspapers. They have gone against the kind of politics is going on. So I think it's the only positive thing they have is now that as long as he can buy the weapon, he can get this probably kind of state support. But otherwise, it doesn't look like so, because economically it is weaker. It's much more weaker, and it doesn't really look as a kind of counterbalance to even China for the decades in future. So I think the Modi has lost a big thing by the economy without losing the economy. So I think this is the right time to keep the pressure on to expose him. Of course, there will be some forces who are supporting with the alliance, with the in Sweden, I face this kind of crisis because Sweden wants to sell 125 fighter planes to India. So I think that has been a kind of a factor which supporting him. But I think
is there a campaign against that in Sweden?
Sorry,
is there a campaign against that planned arms sale in Sweden?
Oh yeah, I mean there have been, of course, but Sweden has a different record of selling plan. But unless it comes with the corruption, I mean, it's because the Swedish company has been now collaborating with the Modi's own friend, which is Adani, to sell this weapon. So I think, but if it comes, it will be a huge corruption scandal. And once the corruption scandal comes in, it will be a big issue in Sweden. So that's what, but till then, this is being sold out quite a big way because it will be $25 billion project.
Thank you, Professor Swain. We just have 2 more minutes, so we'll turn to Brother Muhammad for some final thoughts from Trumpland.
Once again, I'll just reiterate the fact that, knowing all of this is good, but the next step is very important, which is that we do spread this awareness to others, especially those who are not from India. People from India are pretty much aware of what's happening, but also those from India, especially, are very complacent about this whole affair. But now it is impacting on a daily basis. We have seen what is happening in India on a daily basis, how Muslims are being discriminated against. And now this poison of hatred, has been, the coronavirus has come like a blessing in disguise, unfortunately, for these hate mongers. And they're using that to spread more and more poison. So let's not just leave this conference saying, okay, well, we learned about this danger. Let's do something about it. That's all I would like to add at this point.
Thank you so much again to all of our panelists for what was an extremely sobering perspective on what for too long has been hailed as the quote-unquote world's largest democracy, but also for giving us very concrete ideas about things that we can do wherever we are in order to help work for justice in India. We heard earlier about this myth of the love jihad being waged by Muslims. But when we think about what a love jihad should actually mean, it simply means a struggle for love. And so, inshallah, may we all go from here better equipped to engage in this struggle for love. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.